Hello, and welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. I'm Joe Devine, and I'm joined now by Seb Stafford-Bloor.
Hi, Joe.
Hello. Today, Seb and I were joined by Paul and Joe Lake. Seb, who are those people?
Paul and Joe Lake wrote one of my favourite football books of all time. Paul was a highly promising Manchester City player. He got hurt within a month of the Premier League starting. And he was Manchester City's captain. He was 2.5 games into his captaincy and a new 5-year contract, and he hurt his knee, and it ended his career. And when they got married, Paul and Joe wrote a brilliant account of not just his injury and his struggles to overcome it, but also his afterlife, his rebound from that, and his life after football. It's just absolutely fascinating book. And it's that rare thing. It's a football book that I've never heard anybody say anything bad about. It's universally loved, and rightly so.
No, it's very, very good. And what was most interesting to me about the podcast that we've just recorded is the discussion about the dynamic between those two people as well, because the process of writing a book about your husband's life for Joe, who's a ghostwriter by trade, is a very interesting and intimate process. So we were curious to dig down into that a little bit more too and find out about how that all happened. But anyway, if you want to dig down more into things and find out how things happen in a good way, you should subscribe to The Athletic. And you can do that by visiting theathletic.com/Tifo, where you can get a 30-day free trial to read all of the things at your heart's desire. I'm thinking, of course, Paul is a huge Manchester City legend and fan, and of course, I expect that he'd enjoy the writing of Sam Lee. Don't you think so, Seb?
I think so, but more importantly, Joe, I think you need to ad-lib us towards a slight recording anomaly that we experience, so that I can explain a character that comes up in our conversation. Do you want to do that seamlessly?
Yes, I would like to do that. And wow, it would have been seamless if you hadn't have done that. Anyway, that's theathletic.com/Tifo. Do please go and check out the 30-day free trial. Loads of fantastic stuff to fill all of your time. Never have to think about anything. Never ever. Just fill your time with football. Anyway, the key piece of information that you might want to hear for later in the podcast is as follows. There is a man named Peter Swales, and Seb, you ask Paul about him at a certain point without much context. I just wondered if in 10 seconds you can give us the context as to who Peter Swales was and why you were asking Paul.
I can indeed, Joe. Peter Swales was the former Manchester City chairman. He was ousted by Francis Lee when he took over the chairmanship. I was trying very hard not to spoil a passage of the book, and in fact, I did it too efficiently.
You were so efficient. I didn't have any idea what you were talking about.
Exactly, but there's your context, and now you can enjoy that 5-minute segment.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, well, listen, Paul and Joe, a remarkable book, a special couple, and lovely podcast. So we'll now, without further ado, leave you in the warm hands and the cool embrace of Paul and Joe Lake.
Guys, thank you so much for coming on. I suppose it makes sense to start at the beginning and to ask where the idea for the book came from and what the motivations were in putting it together.
Well, I think we go back to it was the summer of 2009, and Paul and I and the kids, our kids, were on holiday in Northumberland. And I remember one evening the kids were in bed and we were outside sitting on the veranda, lovely night, watching the sun go down. And we were just chatting, and Paul was reminiscing about his career and just various things that were coming to mind. And I just said to him, you know what, you've got such a fantastic story in you. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could tell it one day, even if it's just for family? Because, it is such a unique tale. And then we kind of talked some more. And my background, I'd never written a book before, but I'd worked at Man United and Man City in the publications departments. I'd written articles, I'd conducted interviews, so I was fairly up to speed with that kind of thing, but never written a book. And I said to Paul, you know what, maybe we should tackle it ourselves and see how far we get. And if it doesn't work, well, there's probably plenty of other writers that want to take up your story because it is so different. So we got back home to Manchester and we started, and we kind of approached it really professionally. I mean, obviously I was Paul's wife, but I approached it as a writer, and it just kind of started from there. And each night we'd put the kids to bed and we would sit in the lounge, and Paul would sit on one settee, I'd sit on the other, and he would just chat. I would tape, and then the next few days, weeks, I would spend just putting it all together, basically. And as the weeks went by and as the chapters started to form, I just thought, this is kind of working, it's clicking. And then we sent some of the material over to a few friends of ours. Do you want to take over?
Yeah, so we're at a stage where we're quietly, obviously happy with the content and how we'd developed the chapters, if you will, to begin with. But then we thought, well, are we just being overly kind to each other? And we needed to get this sense checked. And so on the back of that, we decided to send the chapters over to a few friends of ours to get a second opinion and some honest feedback. And that group included people who were obviously in the business, albeit to a greater or lesser extent. And the feedback en masse was really, really positive, and so much so that, it was quite an exciting time for us.
Yeah, so one of our friends is a photographer called Kevin Cummins, and we submitted just the first 3 chapters to him, just said, look, cast your eye over it and tell us what you think. And he's written a few books himself. He's a photographer, and obviously he's quite prolific in that respect. And he passed it on to his literary agent, who, again, came back with some fantastic feedback and distributed it to various publishers. I mean, it was just dreamland for us. As I said before, we were just looking at it as just a family chronicle, maybe something that a local publisher might pick up. But suddenly we've got a literary agent who's sending our little book to the top level publishers in London. It was dream time, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Can I ask, I know it's a really strange question, but Paul, was it, when I first wrote the book, I reread it over the weekend actually, but when I first read the book, the openness and the honesty really, it took me away a little bit, because it's not really, those aren't really qualities you associate with footballers' autobiographies. So was it a difficult thing to share, not only with your wife, but with the knowledge that this was probably going to go out to the world? Was that a difficult thing to overcome?
I suppose I didn't really see it or think about it in that context, to be honest. It was quite, I'll be honest, it was quite a cathartic process. And I mean, it's not often that your wife becomes your counsellor, but it was really interesting because it gave me an avenue in which I could basically describe all of my built up emotions, because I had no life experience of anything other than being in a football bubble. And you are cosseted up to a point, albeit, obviously within reason at Manchester City at that particular time. But even so, I didn't really know, once I'd been injured and the amount of upset and heartache and all the false dawns and the false promises and the lack of support and emotional guidance I was given, I had all of this pent up emotion inside of me with nowhere to kind of vent, if you will, and it wasn't doing my mental health any good whatsoever. So in point of fact, these sessions, because obviously it was Joanne and I trusted Joanne implicitly, I was able to really open up. And the more that I spoke, the more that I felt that there was so many layers to my emotions and so many layers to my troubles, and the fact that I'd not dealt with it and didn't know how to deal with it, that all these emotions and all of this heartache and hurt and came out in the book. And there was also it was also born out of speaking with quite a few fans in different guises, and it was one particular fan that actually was angry with me, and he blamed me for the demise of our team, because I was regarded as being the next best thing, if you will, and I'd already spoken with the England managers and was regarded as being a potential future England captain. Howard Kendall had made me captain. I had, such an exciting, the prospects and the potential was quite an exciting, time for me. And then he blamed me, saying that I didn't work hard enough, I didn't try hard enough, and I should have done more, and that I'd let people down. And I'd worked tirelessly, and in terms of the rehabilitation and having to start again and to try and find some resolve and some resilience to be able to carry on. And I couldn't believe I was hearing these things. So on the back of that, having all of that to deal with, and once you're in that mindset, you just ruminate and you can't shift these feelings and all these mixed emotions of anger and regret and frustration and disappointment kind of, came to the fore. And so thankfully, speaking to Joanna, being able to open up, I was able to be in a much, much better place. But also it was the nature of the questions that Joanne was asking. So she won't necessarily say that, but there's a real talent to it, because she almost guided me and enabled me to give me that time and that silence just to really speak. And I think it was the perfect environment for me to really open up.
Before you began this process, and then there's another moment in the book where you become an outpatient at the Manchester branch of the Priory, and you describe a lot of your emotions spilling out with a therapist. Before you reached these stages, were a lot of these emotions just rattling around inside of you with nowhere to go?
Well, again, I didn't know how to deal with this emotion. I couldn't even describe it, and they were overlapping. So and you go through sort of stages where just driving along, you're thinking about not only what might have been, but also then the reasons why things didn't work out, and then you do reflect inwardly around what could I have done, and should I have been more vocal in terms of getting second opinions and challenging the medical team. But let's be honest, when you're a professional footballer at that particular time, I wouldn't even know what an anterior cruciate ligament was. Never mind what the rehabilitation should have been, or what consultants I should have spoke with, or should I have a second opinion? Was I insured? What's the prognosis? What are the time frames? Who are the specialists that I should be speaking with? What's their experience? What's their success rate? What type of surgery? So you can imagine, just on that one level, I was so naive, and therefore had to put my trust in other people. And so on the back of that alone, you think about things and you get angry with yourself, because it was my one chance to get back fit, having the best care and attention possible. But I didn't even know that I wasn't receiving the best advice and best attention. So, therefore, you look back and you're thinking, when other people are speaking, did you have an agent? No. Did you have a medical confidant? No. Was there anybody else that you could speak with in terms of this type of injury? Well, no. So that alone was just almost torturing yourself in terms of didn't know but should have known. Why didn't I know? And all of these missed opportunities that you ruminate on, and you think, well, who else could I have turned to? But ultimately, you feel that, perhaps I was just too naive and too trusting. And that then brings on this frustration and this anger, this missed opportunity when this period of time in my life where I should have been in control and I wasn't. So when I was at the Priory, it was just almost, untangling this spiral of emotion that had just become so intertwined that I didn't know how I felt about anything. And so every emotion flared its ugly head in every situation.
Joe, do you mind if I ask, how long had you known Paul before you got married?
We got married in 2001. I probably met Paul 97. So, but yeah, probably about 3 years before we got married.
So were you in a position to not observe, because that makes him sound like a laboratory rat, but were you in a position to notice the changes in him during that period?
Well, I'm a City fan from birth almost. So, I followed Paul's career, obviously years and years and years before I got to him as a person. And I followed his the awful career-ending injury that he had, but also the high points as well. I was there in the Manchester Derby, the 5-1, and saw this wonderful player. But I did, of course, I did. I mean, my dad was a huge City fan as well, and he was absolutely obsessed with Paul. He just thought he was one of the best young players he'd ever seen, and he would chronicle how this wonderful player had so much to offer, had so much promise, and yet his career had obviously been so cruelly taken away from him. So when I started work at City, I did know Paul on a personal level, and also just as he was retiring, I actually wrote his testimonial brochure. So I did get a kind of sense of the depths that he was plumbing at the time.
Can I ask at this point? I've seen a psychotherapist for about 4 or 5 years, and I remember having a conversation with him the other day where I acknowledged, and as did he, that I probably share a lot of aspects of my life with him that I don't with my partner, for example. And maybe those are just things that are too small to consider being brought up on a daily basis, or are just things that are lost out when you're in part of a dialogue rather than a monologue. But Joe, can I ask, and I suppose this question applies to Paul as well, did you find throughout the process of writing the book, you're obviously learning so much about your husband, and Paul, obviously you're sharing so much with your wife. Do you prize that experience? Because it's something that probably even people who spend 30, 40 years together might not actually ever sort of delve into those depths just in natural conversation. Do you consider it to be an experience that you're pleased to have had in that sense?
Oh, absolutely. It was an absolutely eye-opening experience for me, because while I knew that Paul had been depressed in the past, I had absolutely no idea to the extent of that depression until we started writing the book. And as Paul said, we did it in such a relaxed environment. These writing sessions, these talking sessions were often like therapy. And it was absolutely enlightening to me and surprising and shocking, because I'd been married to Paul, but when we started the book, we'd all been married for 10 years. And the actual depths to which he plumbed and the depression that he went through, I had no idea how hard the difficulties that he'd gone through.
And can I ask Paul specifically as well, you say in the book, there's a couple of things I want to point out. One is a quote where you say, "The willpower required to bottle up my emotions, conceal my symptoms, and feign normality left me utterly exhausted." And this is before you started attending therapy. And after you started attending, close to the beginning, you talk about how you were so worried that a City fan or someone at the club might find out that you were in psychotherapy. So you carried a check that you'd scrawled on so that in case someone discovered you, you could pretend that you were on your way to donate to a charity that was based at the centre. I want to ask about football specifically, and maybe sport more broadly. Do you feel that there is, or there can be, a natural culture within the locker room, for example, that makes sharing those sorts of emotions or those sorts of conversations more difficult? And at the time, do you think that would be comparable in wider culture, or that's something that maybe can be specifically attributed to sports, which has a sort of a hyper goals orientated environment and often can be quite masculine, where there's lots of men together?
Yes, it's a really, really interesting question, because obviously since the days when I had to retire to where we are now, I feel like, kind of, if you will, player care and all around being able to speak about, mental illness and all those types of things have changed dramatically. However, at the same time, you kind of brushed on this when you spoke about Joanne and I speaking, in a quiet, safe space to talk about, my innermost feelings, and And that was difficult to do so, but I felt that I could. And as we spoke more and the process became more natural, it became really comfortable to be able to do so. In a changing room, you've got a couple of things. You've got players that are obsessed about themselves, about their performance. And especially in today's football, you've got players who are pretty much brands in their own right. So they've got so many things to think about. And because of the nature of football today, once you come in, the preparation is meticulous. Everything is mapped out to the nth degree. Then the training session begins. The focus of the training. Then afterwards, you have that kind of cool down. Then you might have some media work to do. And it's almost like there's a structure in place that goes right the way through that. I don't really get the sense that there is that opportunity to really speak to anybody, about your emotions. It's quite superficial and not in an unpleasant way, but it's just the nature of those environments. It feels like that opportunity would never really take place. And ironically, I would suggest that the culture of certainly the overseas players, so, the Spanish players and the French players and the German players, I feel that they'd actually be more open to having those conversations than the British players. But I think that's quite a sweeping statement because individually everyone's different. But I would say that it's more the nature of the environment and how driven it is and how goal orientated it is that you don't really get those moments. When I was playing, obviously you had players we would just share a coach together. We would share, it was like twin rooms. So you were with somebody, in close proximity, and you pretty much stayed those room partners throughout the season. So you really got to know people, and that depth. Today, I would imagine that players have individual rooms, their own space, and so I think it's quite different. So I don't so much feel that although the culture is changing, and it has changed, I just think that the opportunity to speak to colleagues around really personal situations will only take place if, say, that person makes a real effort to speak to you outside of the football club. So when the Spanish players first come over, the Argentinian players, the Brazilian players, the African players, then there might be opportunities to speak more because they might meet up away from the football club and speak more, and then the opportunity over time. But there's also that trust which you need to build with someone to be able to truly open up, and that itself takes time, which you may not have because of those superficial relationships. Whereas Joanne and I are able to speak at length in our own space, in our own time. And she gave me the silence and the time, the freedom to be able to speak. So I think it's more a case of the circumstances rather than the nature of what you've, of the question that you've asked.
Not forgetting the professional staff that football clubs that have now that didn't have then. I mean, there was nobody for you to open up to, was there? No psychologists, no counsellors. You're on your own. That's
right. And that's where, again, if a player was having a really difficult time, it would probably be his agent he might speak to first, or the physiotherapist if it was a one-to-one, or even the club doctor. And they might be signposted and might be happy for that to take place. But other circumstances, there are some individuals that are very, very private, and there is that sense that they're showing a weakness or a chink in their armour. And so there's a little bit of that. When I played, there was a lot more of that. And you didn't want to speak to players because you didn't know them that well and thought, well, actually, do they really want to listen to me? Have they got the time and have they got the skill sets to be able to interpret it in the right way? So you felt like you didn't want to speak to people because you didn't really feel that you were going to be heard. So it's okay to listen to someone to respond, but to listen to understand is a different thing. I think all those things combined is probably a reason why back in those days there was a culture, but there was also on an individual basis, you had to really get to know somebody and you never really did.
Can I ask as well, specifically, I suppose, you say that, the culture has changed, which I think is probably a fair assessment. When you were playing, you write in the book that, you recall a situation with Stan Collymore when he was diagnosed with depression at Aston Villa, that his manager responded to that with cynicism, saying, what's he got to be depressed about? And so I wondered, in your day of playing, Do you find that in some ways a football club might maintain that sort of culture in part because the people who end up in senior coaching roles within the club will tend generally to have come from football and will have learnt the rules of the environment from their coaches, and as far back as you can go, which is why maybe it's a difficult sort of a thing to break?
Yeah, and I think at the same time, and no disrespect to anyone who has gone into coaching and actually may have a different thought process, but at the time, there was the things that were in your kind of your realm of responsibility might be just around the football and the motivation and the driving somebody, and it's right that you do have certain coaches, certain staff members that would have a more sensitive nature and might just recognise with people skills, they might recognise those signs of non-verbal communication. But as I'm sure people are aware today, is that to be that coach or that individual that's going to be happy to speak about those things at that time involved change, and with change comes fear. And I just feel that you had to be a really, really strong character to stand up and be able to say in front of a group of men back in those days that if anyone has got any emotional issues, any fears, any confidence issues, then by all means speak to me and we can talk through it. I will help you. And it's not a sign of weakness to talk about that. It's actually a sign of strength. At that time, there was nobody with not only the skills and the knowledge, but it's how it reflected upon them as well. So I think there was almost, like you say, there was a party line which everybody adhered to, which just meant that people in that sense were never heard. And so you just, to get along, you go along as the saying goes. And I think that's exactly where the coaches were at back in those days.
Paul, when a career ends, what is the overriding emotion? Is it a regret at what life could have been or what you could have achieved on the pitch? Is it more of an anger at the people who may have been able to make a difference or may have changed the trajectory with a different diagnosis? Or is it a fear of what life's going to be like without football? Because your childhood was consumed by football. There was never really any sense that you were going to do anything else, and you would have played for England and had this career, and that would have been that. So is it a combination of all those three, or was it one of those amongst the others that was sort of had the sort of the overriding effect on you?
I think it's a combination of all those things, really, and I think again it's all in context. I mean, from the start of it, there was the physical ramifications of having to retire, being left with having to have my legs straightened. So there was a physical result of all of the attempts to try and get fit and of failed surgery. There was the worry of what am I going to do next, because I was conditioned, institutionalized into the game, so I didn't know anything else. There was the fear of having to go out into the outside world, into the real world, and to not have any real skill sets or any idea of what direction I was going to go in. There was the financial implications of where do I go next, and I had a mortgage to pay, and I had the potential of a testimonial, but no guarantees that anything would come of that, and also there was the identity piece. Where if I wasn't a footballer, who was I? I suddenly became a knee joint. So even when anyone spoke to me, the first thing they asked was not "How are you, Paul?" It was "How's your knee?" And I would try and pacify them and try to make them feel good about speaking to me, but inside every conversation I had, it just made me sink deeper and deeper into this emotional abyss that I was falling into. So it was all those things and probably more besides. And I come back to it. I didn't know anything else. I didn't know anybody else. I had no one to turn to, no one to speak with. And it was a disgrace really to leave a young man high and dry like that. And I suppose now and again, when you have depression, which is something that I didn't know I had depression, I was sunk so low that, it never truly leaves you. It's an illness which you can manage and you can cope with, but the scars are there. And although you can't see them, it takes different stages in your life that can bring those those emotions back to the fore. And I have had dips, and I do struggle now and again. And those emotions come right out. They're very fresh. The resentment, the anger, the frustration, the sadness, and the longing of what might have been. All those things can come out at different stages. And luckily, with the relationship that I have with my wife and with my family, means that if I am having a bad time, I can speak about it. And even my employers have been absolutely tremendous in how to give me that space and time and help. So I'm fortunate in some respects, but it's taken all those dark times and all those experiences to make me realise that when those things are coming to a head, and basically how to deal with them.
But what I would add to that as well, Paul probably wouldn't mention himself, is that he's never, ever, despite everything he's gone through, shown any bitterness at all. And I think that kind of comes through the book as well. Not one shade of bitterness. As he says, he has longing, he has regrets, but never, ever has he shown any bitterness. And I just respect him so much for that.
That's actually going to be my next question, because Paul comes across as very self-effacing in the book. And I think it's very difficult for someone like me to put myself in your position, Paul. But if I was surrounded by fans who came up to me and they know you presumably as Paul, late Manchester City player, and as you said before, the knee joint, I think I would really struggle to keep my sense of humour and to remain positive. But you do always come out like that in the book.
I think humour's been a defensive mechanism for me, really. And I suppose sometimes that can be a mask that you can wear. And I did have to do that. But again, you come back to it, you have to try and think of it from somebody else's frame of reference. It's a combination of not really knowing what you've been through or what you're going through. And their attempts at humour and at just mentioning about your knee or whatever are just ways to, in their own way, say, I'm really sorry for what you've been through and I hope you're okay. So if you think of it in those terms, then you can't really be hard on anybody. And there have been people that have made some jibes and jokes. And again, it comes from a point of ignorance, really. And it's their lookout that they're sadly coming from that position, which is not a healthy position, and surely isn't something that they would look back on as think it's a place that really they would want to come from. But so I always try to think of it in terms of the individual, and even to make the effort to come over to you and say, how are you and how is your knee? I think that shows that someone in their own way is showing some some sympathy and at times empathy, but that they do care. So I'd always try and deal with it in a certain way, and even be self-deprecating to some degree, to try and make them feel better. But that was difficult, because I kept doing that, but there came a point where, I actually felt that I had a knot in my stomach because I was doing that all of the time. But again, so a lot of the humour that I used was a way of almost having to deal with the situation. And as you mentioned before, a lot of the effort involved in trying to keep those emotions at bay was exhausting, and so I would come home sometimes and literally just lie on the bed and just fall to sleep, and it would be like that. So it was a case of, over time, just trying to find different mechanisms that you would use to try and get through a day or get through a situation, and I found that way worked for me, but only up to a point.
Can I say, listening to both of you talk, I think it's such a fascinating story, and it's clear that the relationship that you have is a wonderful thing as well. The ability to be able to talk to people, talk to each other in a free sense in the way that you do, and when you put it in those terms, it really is very simple to look at other people, or people that you know, or people that you've met, and realize how difficult it can be for many people to even just have a very simple conversation with their partner. What advice, and I appreciate this is not an easy question to answer, but given your experience of your relationship, what advice could you give to people who are finding life difficult and maybe aren't, or are finding it difficult to share at home or in their intimate relationships? How do you get over the hump of initially doing that? And it's a trust thing, right?
Yeah. And I suppose when you share someone's difficulties and you are consistent with that, I think that because when you show your most vulnerable side, that's when you get a real sense of the depth of a relationship, and sometimes it can be quite frightening for the partner as well as for the individual, because they might not have dealt with it before, might not know what to say, might be fearful of saying the wrong thing. So I think it's that conversation that you have, is that, first of all, it's okay to not be okay. And it's okay to be honest and say, look, I don't know what to say, I don't know what to do, I don't know how to be, but I'll do my very, very best. And I think that's a starting point. And you still get things wrong. And we still had arguments, we still had fallouts, get me wrong. It was then, that's normal life. And I suppose in the scheme of things, for us, it's recognizing that, you can have a discussion and you can have a heated debate and you can fall out over something, but it's recognizing that in those moments, it's all about the moment and the subject matter. It's when you harbour those things and then you keep returning to those emotions around other aspects. You can fall out over. I mean, as an example, we might drop a pot in the garden. It's Joe's favourite pot, and there's a few expletives that are coming in my direction, and rightly so. But then, if I've parked the car in the wrong place and or I've not opened the car door and it's pouring down outside, that anger shouldn't reflect on the pot that I dropped 4 weeks ago. It's all around putting it into context. And I think what happens is our subconscious mind takes over, and those emotions are there, they're fresh and they're raw. So once you know yourself and you know what drives you, and then Joanne knows what my drivers are, and I know what her drivers are, I know what her triggers are as well. And I think once you get to know each other properly and you show yourselves at your most vulnerable moments, and that doesn't need to be alcohol fueled or drug fueled. It's just being yourself. And I think that's the key, is if you bear yourself and you just, be absolutely honest about, this is who I am, and warts and all, these are my drivers, these are my flaws, and you just be if you're able to truly be yourself, you can be at peace. And I think that is the key to a really, really healthy relationship, is you see each other at the best and you see each other at the absolute worst. And that's absolutely fine, because that's life.
Yeah. I mean, the process of writing the book in itself has helped us as a couple, there's no doubt about it, and has given me that depth of knowledge about depression that I did not have before we embarked upon it. And, as Paul has freely admitted himself, he has dips. And when he does have dips, it's very easy for the partner, me, to feel a little helpless, not, as Paul said, not sure what to do, not sure what to say. But it's just being there, isn't it, Paul? It's just being there. It's being there to listen. It's being there to offer whatever support you can, and to understand it's not personal. Because sometimes it feels that way. You think, my goodness, have I done something wrong? Should I be doing more? Is he feeling down because of something I've said, I've done, the way I am? And it's not. It's an illness, as Paul said. It's an illness. And I think over the years, we've really sort of started to deal with it a lot better, haven't we?
I think also just let you know that, I understand Joe's drivers and Joe's triggers. I'll know when to speak to her, when to be quiet, and when to duck as well. So, it's about being honest. But again, I think the book, like you said, you made a really, really insightful discovery when you mentioned the idea that the book has enabled us to speak in those depths and to really know each other. And I think you're absolutely right. It has been, we have been quite fortunate. It sounds, ironic that despite the fact that we're talking about my lowest point, it did give us the opportunity, that shared experience, and that definitely, brought us together, and it definitely enabled Joe to understand me in a far greater detail, especially in terms of the depressiveness of the illness that it actually is.
We've been trying to do this without looting from the book and discouraging people from reading it, because ideally we'd like to kind of, for younger people who sort of missed it first time around, we'd like to point them in its direction. People who have read it will understand why I'm asking this, but Peter Swales has been dead for 24 years now. This is really to both of you as well. How do you feel about him today?
It's funny, actually, you should mention that, because we were only talking about this a few days ago, and your perceptions have changed slightly, because I mentioned before, Paul doesn't really have much bitterness about the whole situation, but if anybody comes out worse in the book, it probably is Peter Swales, because of the way Paul perceived the way he dealt with him at the time. But recently, Paul's kind of been reflecting about this and has realised that perhaps he was a little unfair in the way that he judged him.
Yeah, and I think that's born out of, again, just what I've said, frame of reference of walking a mile in someone's shoes. You get a sense of, why they react the way they do. And I suppose I was very judgmental, and maybe a lot of that hurt I directed at him, because, I was made to feel like, and I use that expression again in speaking about it in the book. I was like a piece of meat hung up in an abattoir. It made me feel like I was suddenly invisible. And I've been in City since I was, a very young boy and a City fan, and all my dreams, aspirations, were just ebbing away as the days went by. And for this guy to not only treat me the way that he was, but the fact that he even challenged me about how I was feeling. I believe that this man was treating me the way that he was, and making me feel so desperate about my situation, and being so hurtful and just dismissive. I was almost swatted away at times, and it just left me feeling utterly rejected. And so I kind of built up all of this frustration and all these emotions. I suppose I did target in his direction, but again, as time's gone by, I'm still not a huge fan, because I saw how he spoke to other people. But I'd also I would have to say that he did love Manchester City, and he did love the club, and he thought he was doing things in the right way for the right reasons. So, as 24 years later,
we did paint him as a bit of a villain in the book.
Well, yeah, and that's, you can only go off, you treat people in life how you want to be treated was always my mantra, and treating me in such a way. I signed a 5-year contract for City for by comparison, in footballing terms, for peanuts really. But it was that commitment that it was my team, and I didn't want to sign for anybody else, and that I had to be prized away. And I'd committed to City in good faith, and committed my life. I mean, when I made my debut on a YTS scheme, I was on £26.50 a week when I played my first game for the first team. And all these things are ignored, because it wasn't about the money; it was about playing for my team. And I was prepared to do anything. I wore every shirt for the team. And I even came back from injury when I was 75% fit. I exposed myself in front of thousands of people and didn't play particularly well. And I had to, undertake a backlash from people and did all those things. I wasn't seeing myself as a martyr, but these are the things that I did. And then to be treated in the next breath, because I was injured playing for City, in such a way that I just couldn't understand why someone would treat me so abysmally when I was your captain, 3 months ago, and all of a sudden now I'm this forgotten man who's just a spare part, and so when you speak about Peter Swales, I still have mixed emotions, because I felt that he was the grown up, he was the adult, and he should have known better, but I also believe that football has a strange way of bringing out certain emotions in people. And over time, I just maybe regret that I spoke about him in such a way that may have offended his family, because I wouldn't have wanted that.
See, I don't think you guys did. I mean, I would contest that you paint him as a villain. I think actually, I have a few favourite bits of the book, but one of them is your confrontation with him, which is... It's powerful, and it's wonderfully well written, so you get a real sense of your anger. But I think it's also quite dignified. So I don't think you've done them up, or I don't think it doesn't come across unfair, is what I'm trying to say. One of the last things I want to touch on though is you sometime after your retirement, forgive me, I can't remember which year it is. You're at a Simple Minds concert, and Jim Kerr starting up the opening chords of Alive and Kicking, which for the younger people listening was used on the very first Premier League advert, which don't look up because it's not aged very well at all. But Paul, you describe having a panic attack as a result of that. Now, in my mind, those two things are very logical because they're so associated with each other, and with the trauma that you've experienced. But what was that process like? And also, do you still have these trigger points? Do you still have to kind of to avoid these landmines in everyday life?
I think I've managed that over time, but it's funny. I went to this concert with a friend of mine just for reasons of nostalgia, and it didn't even enter my head about that particular song, and it completely caught me off guard. And it was these emotions that I'd not felt in quite some time, and I was in quite a good place at the time, and just having a chilled out night, a couple of beers with a friend, reminiscing on how this person's aged, and he still dances the way that he used to dance, and all those things. And then this song came out, and it just completely floored me, and it also frightened me because I felt like I couldn't breathe, and I knew what was happening, and I had to just get out of there, and I couldn't even explain to my friend what was taking place. But I think since time, and when you recognize what your triggers are, you're able to prepare yourself and manage those things. So, since that time, if that song comes on in the car,
you will turn it off.
I will turn it off. But then I've managed it, I've coped with it. But there are going to be circumstances. Ironically, I was having my hair butchered a few years ago, and that song came on. I could feel my heart racing, and he had a pair of scissors in his hand, so I had to literally, and I just said, "It's a terrible song, this." And he said, "Oh, really? I'll turn it over," and he did. And it was just one of those just ways of just managing it. But you're absolutely right. The association with certain moments in your life can be triggered by a song, by an expression, by even like music on an advert or something. But it's something that Joe in particular, can recognize. And again, the way that she wrote certain aspects of the book so beautifully has enabled me to almost to put into words how I'm feeling.
But music, interestingly, you mentioned the music side of things. Music was a huge thread in the book as well. I mean, as you know, it's not just about football. We wanted it to be a lot more about music, about Manchester as a place. And music was a huge thread through the book, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. From, obviously, you were lucky enough to go to the Hacienda in its heyday.
That's right, yeah. Your Oasis second ever gig and all that.
You kind of, in the, you mentioned that you realised that you were in the throes of depression when you lost that ability to listen to music. That's
right, and didn't for that whole time. And even in therapy, asking that question and not being able to recognise the association, which he did and you have done, and I have since realised. But at the time, I didn't connect. But it was such a huge part of my life was going to gigs and listening to music. It was absolutely everything for me. It was my other passion apart from football. So to the guilt associated with feeling happy, because it wasn't just the fact that I'd lost a career, and it's something else that I didn't mention before was the social aspect of it, in terms of my family were not particularly wealthy family, and the sacrifices that they made was such that I felt like I wanted to look after them all and pay off their mortgages and give them nice things and nice holidays, like it was my responsibility. And since that time, recognised that my family have come to me and said, we never expected that from you, we just wanted you to be happy. But all those things were caught up in at times in that song. So that was a really trigger. It was a trigger for me. And so turning it off was not only because I felt like I was going to have a panic attack or to feel this anxiety, recognizing it as a trigger and realizing that the best way to deal with it was to just switch it off or just to avoid it. And it's something that, again, is a recognition that we try to portray in the book, But I'm sure people, in society, never mind in football, will have those moments and not be able to recognise that association.
One more question, and it's a selfish one because I've always wanted to know the answer. What's your best position, Paul?
I suppose when I've spoken to lots of fans as well about this, and they all saw me as a kind of a number 8, a box to box midfield player. I actually felt that as a centre half, someone that could attack the football, was okay in the air, but I felt like because I'd experienced different positions during the course of the 3 seasons that I played, that I was able to make good decisions and be able to respect, when to pass a ball, how to pass the ball, what communication to pass on, when to step in, when to step back, when to allow a ball to win because you just can't win that ball, when to make the tackle, when to show somebody inside or outside, when to double up, when to drop. All these things were something that I used in playing centre half. So I felt like as a modern day centre half, certainly in Pep Guardiola's team would be a dream come true. But I felt that that's the kind of player that I was. It comes like a footballing centre half. So really, in the scheme of things, as much as I enjoyed going forward and attacking and assists and really getting involved in games, I felt like I was most comfortable and probably my strongest position would have been as Howard Kendall, rest his soul, identified, and that was as a centre half.
Joe, did you see his debut as a fan?
I'm one of these people that I'm not as good as Paul is about remembering dates and games and that sort of thing. But I was a season ticket holder from the age of 7 till 18, so I will have done. I absolutely will have done.
It was that good,
yeah. But yeah, I will have done. And he was the most incredible player. I mean, and the fantastic thing about City's team at the time, the mid to late 80s, was the amount of local homegrown lads that there were in the team. And obviously Paul was one of them, in the likes of Ian Brightwell, Steve Redmond, Andy Hinchcliffe. It was just a wonderful team to watch. But obviously I was watching from the main stand, absolutely no clue that one day I'd be marrying this person and writing his memoir.
Joe, I have one question for you before we go, although 2, I suppose, actually. The first is, are you writing anything else at the moment? And the second is Paul going to write your book?
Okay. Well, the lovely thing about writing our book was that it kick-started my career as a ghostwriter, really, because as I mentioned before, I'd never ever tackled a book before. I'd done plenty of other writing-related things, but never a book. So once I did Paul's book, I worked with Howard Webb, World Cup referee, on his memoir, which was absolutely wonderful. I loved working with Howard. Fantastic guy. Great story to tell. And then I worked with Paul's former teammate David White on his book. And my most recent project was with former deputy leader of the Labour Party, Tom Watson. He wrote a book about his weight loss journey. So that's the most recent one I've done. And there are a couple of things I'm working on at the moment, but the COVID crisis has kind of stemmed things a little bit at the moment. So I'm hoping to be back at my laptop sooner rather than later. And would he write my memoir? His writing skills have really improved, actually.
I'm more the raconteur than the writer, to be honest.
Yeah. So I think I've there's a few stories I could tell working at Man United, Man City back in the day. So maybe I'll write my own.
Do you know what? There's a specific set of skills I think that go into ghostwriting, and I just wanted to ask you. Obviously, your experience ghostwriting with Paul will have been very intimate in a way that presumably your experience of writing with Tom Watson just wasn't. What's the kind of difference in that process there, and how difficult was it to make the jump from something which is probably very unique to regular ghostwriting?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, really, because obviously, as you say, that the experience with working alongside my husband is probably never going to be replicated again. But as a ghostwriter, I think it's my job to paint a picture with words, almost to show respect to somebody's story by chronicling their life as best you can, and I think more importantly to capture their voice. It's ironic. Everybody I've worked with happens to be male. I'd love to work with a female, but I suppose it is a skill for, you know, a 40-odd-something-year-old woman to try and capture the voice of a former World Cup referee. And I hope I did that okay. So I would say that's probably the main skills that have probably kind of helped my career so far to date. But I always say, I think Paul's book will probably be the best thing I ever do, but I don't think that's probably a surprise for me to say that, because it was such a joy to work with him, and it was an absolute privilege and a pleasure to help tell his story.
It's the debut album thing, isn't it?
It is the debut album thing, but I'm pretty proud of what I've done after that as well, as I said. But I'd love to work with a female. I'd really love to. I've got a few in my sights, but I'd love to work with a female. So we'll see how things go.
Well, Paul and Joe, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure.
It's been a pleasure.
And the book that we've been referencing, of course, is Paul Lake, I'm Not Really Here, available online to purchase still now. 10 years after publication, is it?
Well, it is, yeah. It's 10 years. I think it's 10 years next year. So, yeah, we'll have to have a little celebration, won't we?
We shall.
Right. Well, thanks very much, guys.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.